Já, komið þið sæl, kæru hlustendur og áhorfendur, verið velkomin í Sósíalista allra landa. Ég heiti Viðar Þorsteinsson og einn af þeim sem að sjá þessa þætti eða þessa þáttaröð og sem fjallar náttúrulega baráttu og sósíalisma, verkalýðsbaráttu, réttlætisbaráttu víða veröld og við erum að spjalla við viðmælendur erlendis frá. Og í dag það mér einstök ánægja að segja frá því að við erum með hana Alex N. Press með okkur í spjalli í dag, en hún sem sagt skribent, blaðamaður sem að fylgjast með náið með verkalýðsmálum í Bandaríkjunum, verkalýðsbaráttu og hefur helgast í því að skrifa þau mál, skrifa meðal annars í Jacobin Magazine, tímaritið sem að margir þekkja, og hefur skrifað á fleiri miðla. Hún hefur verið að skrifa verkfallsaðgerðir sem hafa verið í gangi í einstökum fyrirtækjum og svona í Bandaríkjunum. Hún hefur líka skrifað tilraunir til þess að stéttarfélagsvæða vinnustaði eins og Starbucks og Amazon. Og ég ætla sem sagt að heyra í henni og ætlum að spjalla við hana þessi mál, og ég vonast svo til að geta postað líka í linkum á efni eftir hana sem fólk getur líka lesið. So I'm switching to English now, and so I'd like to welcome you to the show, Alex Press. Huge pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking me to come on.
It's awesome to have you. And I was just saying in my brief introduction that you've written extensively about labor issues in America, unions and labor organizing. And I mentioned that we will be posting some links to where people can read your articles in Jacobin Magazine and elsewhere. But so I was thinking, Alex, just to get us started with this conversation, if you could maybe just say a few words about some of the peculiarities about labor organizing in the U.S., because I know that they certainly exist, and yeah, I mean some of the obstacles and challenges that are peculiar to the U.S. when it comes to labor organizing. Could you give us a little bit of background on that?
Sure, of course. So first of all, I wanted to do much more research about the Icelandic labor movement before this conversation. I didn't get there, so I may ask you questions so we can compare.
Yeah, sure.
So the United States, as I'm sure everyone knows, is the rich here are very rich, the powerful are very powerful, right? So that's it. The most baseline obstacle is that capital, largely has captured the state. In the United States for a long time. And that flows down into most notably US labor law. So in the United States, workers are really governed by a pretty restrictive, narrow regime of what they can and cannot legally do. Now, as I'm sure you would agree, workers always have the right to organize, regardless, say, of what's in the details of the law. So workers organized unions, went on strike, so on and so forth, before there was any kind of governing law in the United States around this. In 1935, we got what is now sort of the dominant sort of governing framework for labor organizing, which was the National Labor Relations Act. So that was passed under FDR's presidency. There had been for over 100 years, of course, labor organizing, but this was an attempt by the state to sort of manage things rather than really repress things. I think that's one really unique element of U.S. labor history that might not be so true today now, but in the past, organizing at your workplace was deadly. When you look at comparisons in the United States, the early labor movement versus other countries, just the amount of repression was really extraordinary. Private security, just killing workers en masse, killing families, evicting people from their homes, of course, when there were company towns, so on and so forth. So it was really very chaotic and very high stakes. So that's where the NLRA comes in, says, okay, we need to manage this rather than let workers sort of do as they please and feel like they have nothing to lose. This is chaos. And so the NLRA is the process by which, if you read the news about a new campaign for a union in the US, you'll often hear that they are filing for an NLRB election. So the NLRB is the board that is linked to the NLRA that sort of oversees union elections. And so they, will make sure they'll do what they can to sort of ensure neutrality and so on and so forth as the votes take place. So that's really the dominant framework. I know in Europe, there's a lot more minority unionism where, there's a sense that It doesn't have to be every worker in the workplace is in the union. You know, there's a sense of recognition among workers to sort of come to their own terms of what their unions should be. That doesn't really exist in the United States. So those sorts of, the sense that unions sort of are governed by the workers' wishes is not really reality in America.
So what you're referring to the fact that when it comes to individual workplace organizing, there needs to be a majority of the workers who need to agree to unionize. And if they don't get that majority, then the workplace cannot unionize and you really can't be a union member in any meaningful sense.
Right. And while there are exceptions to that in certain industries and certain regions of the country that are really resistant to unionism, by and large, it's sort of a foreign concept here, the idea of a minority union. And so from there, without getting too bogged down in sort of boring details about labor law, you know, within that framework, there's a host of obstacles that you sort of often hear about when a campaign is happening. There is, you know, some of it is about what workers can and cannot do when it comes to strikes. So in the United States, an employer cannot fire workers for striking, but they can, and this is the exact quotes here, permanently replace workers. When I explain this to people, it sounds laughably stupid because that distinction doesn't really make sense. What it actually means in practice is, of course, that an employer can just find new workers to replace the ones that go on strike. So things like that make things very difficult, right? Yeah. And so union contracts here, take a long time to reach a first contract. And then the number of narrow sort of constraints on workers when it comes to taking action over problems in the workplace just go on and on, whether it's other people being able to boycott or support a strike. All of those things are sort of outlawed by Taft-Hartley is the act. And we can go into right to work laws, but that's part of that as well.
And this, I suppose, also explains why labor struggles in the U.S. are not even, I mean, they're not about, like, say, raising the wage, but they tend to be about the actual right. I mean, it's about like for the original step of just getting a union to begin with in that particular workplace and just to get a collective contract to begin with, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the product of all of these advances by capital and these laws that they have passed is just a constant narrowing down of what workers can really win, which isn't to say that these things can't change or that good things haven't been won. But yes, it's absolutely every step of the way is a battle in a way that I think is particularly kind of unique compared to especially European countries. But the United States, it's a fight to even just exercise rights that are legally yours.
And as a result of this, of course, the union density, as it's called, the rate of workers who actually are in unions is of course remarkably low. What is it now in the US? Is it like 11, 12% or even less?
It's around 10%. And the one,
10, right.
Yeah. And it's been like that for a long time now. It's been slightly declining. It goes up or down a 0.1 or 0.2, but it's around 10. And I would just say that also sort of obscures a big difference between the private and the public sector. So in the United States, about 37% of public sector workers are union. And so their unions are pretty strong and established, right? As far as that being just a normal
That's the teachers' unions and the postal workers' union.
Right, government workers. Whereas the private sector is around, I think, 7% now. And so that 10% really obscures a huge divide about really private sector organizing in this country is embattled in a way that is very hard to ever over-exaggerate.
And that 7% in the private market has tended to be, I suppose, relatively privileged groups of workers in, say, in industry and manufacturing. Isn't that the case?
That is largely the case, yes, because that's a product of sort of where unions really got a foothold long ago, right? That those workers still have unions and that's established.
Yes. The auto manufacturing plants, the steel industry and those. And when I say relatively privileged, I mean in comparison to, say, service workers or even lesser paid workers. Right. Yeah, this is of course quite a different situation than from what we from what we have in Iceland, where the union density is, I think it's some type of world record. It's over 90% here in Iceland. But of course, that also has its own, there are certain disadvantages that come with that. I mean, you have unions. I mean, the union movement here in Iceland is, of course, heavily bureaucratized, and it has very little of that sort of, spirit of grassroots organizing that we see going on in the U.S. But so am I mistaken to sort of to feel that union activity and unionization drives have been on the rise in the U.S. in the last few years?
I think it's complicated. There's definitely been an uptick recently in a couple big fights, a willingness by workers to sort of fight harder for better contracts, and a willingness to strike. I don't want to dismiss that momentum, and specifically just in the past year or so, I'm thinking of a bunch of workers at John Deere, which is this extremely American brand, right? The Heartland and so on. They not only went on strike, but kept rejecting poor contracts, right? Which is a hard thing to do, because while you said Icelandic unionism is very bureaucratic, America has that problem too. And so a willingness for the rank and file workers to go against kind of the leadership on the proposed contracts and vote them down repeatedly and hold out for more, that is very significant, right? And they did win much stronger contracts. Similarly, there was a threatened strike in the film industry here among workers in a union called IATSE, which is very, similarly not prone to strikes. And yet workers here, authorized a strike vote by almost 99%. And it just at the last minute was a tentative agreement reached, which, had it not been, would have shut down that whole industry across the country. And obviously American film and TV, huge industry, massively visible in public. And so certainly in the private sector, things like that, as well as food manufacturing workers, Nabisco, Kellogg's, they both went on strike during the pandemic. So there has been that. There has been a real sort of visible bunch of fights. But the reality is that most workers, first of all, are not in unions. So they're not in a place to win new things, nor go on strike for better conditions. Really, the energy is what people are calling the Great Resignation, which is that people are quitting their jobs and finding new ones, or going to other industries entirely. And I think it's important to highlight sort of the ambiguity of the word resignation. It means literally people are resigning, but also there's a resignation in the sense that you cannot fight for more. And I think that's all you can do is, get a slightly higher paying job elsewhere. But there's really not a sense of collective organization that you and your coworkers could kind of stick together and do something at your job. And so I think it's really a mixed bag. It's certainly a good thing that people are sort of writing more about unions, are sort of hyping up what existing fights exist. But I wouldn't go so far as to pretend that we're anywhere where we need to be, right? When we talk about a strike wave, in the United States, that used to mean, in the 40s, we were talking about millions and millions of workers going on strike. Now we are nowhere near that.
Sure. Yeah. So perhaps we're more talking about, kind of individual, maybe sort of like high profile battles that we're maybe hoping that will, plant seeds and create, inspiration elsewhere, especially if they succeed. I mean, I'm thinking of an example like the John Deere fight, which ended up gaining some real benefits for those workers, right, as a result of fighting. I mean, it's always important to show that that fighting will give you benefits. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's the case. And I think, one thing that is significant was that all of those fights I described were private sector. And so that's pretty unusual for the reasons I laid out earlier, that, unionization is so minuscule in the private sector. It's usually public sector workers who are sort of more willing to fight. And so the fact that it was in the private sector, and not just in one industry, right? I mean, food manufacturing, film, factory work, auto workers. So that was significant, because that sort of spreads in a way that maybe one particular sector of workers going on strike doesn't.
Right. Did you say that the IATSE strike was approved by 99%?
Well, they didn't strike, but yes, the vote that said,
that was the vote. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in the US, you'll vote. Am I agreeing that if the leadership at the table says this is it, we have to strike, am I agreeing that they can do that? And so that vote was, yes, overwhelming. And in fact, the vote to accept that tentative agreement was almost exactly split 50-50. So a lot of workers were very upset that they didn't strike and get better conditions. So I think this is another this is one significant thing that I haven't touched on, which is one real energy here is happening at the rank and file level. So it's sort of the workers on the shop floor who are kind of pushing their union leaders here. And we've seen that in two other significant places. One is that the Teamsters, which remain one of the most powerful unions in this country with over 1 million members, they just elected new leadership that was sort of the reform side. So they unseated the long and ugly legacy of the Hafas, who are maybe the most well-known labor leaders from the United States. And they ran on a campaign of being more willing to fight, right? They ran about organizing Amazon, about being willing to strike at UPS, which there are about 250,000 UPS workers under one contract. It's the biggest contract in the United States in the private sector. And so that's significant. There was also a reform effort in the UAW, the Auto Workers Union, that won to sort of add more democracy to the union itself. So those are the kind of things that people outside the labor movement might not understand as very significant. But when we're talking about sort of changing the ability of the worker on the shop floor to go on to fight, it in fact might pay real dividends as far as what the next few years look like.
Yeah. And of course, you're touching upon a certain also, I suppose, peculiarity of the U.S. labor movement, which is this weird association with organized crime, which is, I mean, of course, it's not unknown. I mean, I've some people have explained to me that, I mean, in certain parts of the world, I mean, that is sort of how unions do, and they operate sort of like rackets in a way. But yes, there was that element with the Teamsters in the U.S. and also I suppose that happened because I mean, the government, because there was this violent repression and purging, I suppose, of communists and socialists out of the labor movement in the U.S. So it was sort of left up to, I don't know, less, the people who weren't as good people, I will say, as a socialist,
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. That's absolutely part of the story, is that the anti-communist purges in the U.S. labor movement have a real lasting impact and were extreme, right? And to this day, the fact that we even sometimes talk about like the U.S. left as separate from U.S. labor, that's a product of that division that was really brutally enforced, right? And there's also the matter that, when you have unions in decline, which we had, have had for decades, the people leading those unions, which, get bureaucratized, no matter how small or how meager they may seem compared to other countries, it becomes a sense that you're not going on the offensive. You can't really win more. So can you cut deals with the boss? Can the president of the union, get a grift going where he's getting something out of it? And maybe his comrades and partners at the top of the union are getting something out of it. So there's not really a fightingness going on, right? So it does become just a racket, like any other.
Exactly. And also, I suppose the impact of deindustrialization has also sort of led to this, where the strongholds of unions in the U.S. have been in the sectors that have, in some cases, been declining, right? Because those factories have been closed down, and there's this. I mean, I'm just thinking about the Wire series, which kind of shows that in a fictional story, where you can really get a sense of how this community of working class people in Baltimore is just under attack, and they're just grasping at straws. They're trying to bribe the politicians into, building some new factory or something on the harbor so that they can just have jobs. And so it doesn't even get to be a question of hey, let's raise our wages. So uphill battle for sure. But I will still say that it is inspiring to see a lot of this activity that's happening, at least in some sectors in the U.S. And I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit about some of those cases that you have been looking at in detail. I mean, so there have been these attempts at unionization in Amazon, in the distribution facilities. and which have proven quite difficult and have not succeeded so far. But I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a story there about the Amazon unionization efforts.
Sure. So I write a lot about Amazon workplace organizing, and in part that's because I think people need to understand that Amazon has now, I was writing about this before the pandemic, but since the pandemic, Amazon has basically swallowed the US economy. They have hired so many people. The rate of hiring in this country for Amazon is basically historically unprecedented. People have sort of searched for precedents, and they were like, maybe people manufacturing airplanes at the beginning of World War II were doing this sort of hiring. So it's really a shocking level of growth, and in entire communities and parts of the country, it's just like a company town. Everybody works at Amazon. And so, as far as the just numbers wise, the significance of this as a part of the economy is just impossible to understand, I think, for a lot of people outside of the US. Like when we talk about workers quitting their jobs at, say, low paying fast food places, this is a good thing, right? Because they're finding jobs that might pay better. But in fact, the reality on the ground is that they're basically all going to work at Amazon. And is that really a good workplace? I would say most people would say no. And so, Amazon operates as sort of this vanguard of capital in the United States. Other employers look at it and say, what can we get away with? Is Amazon getting away with this? Then maybe we can too. As well as Amazon creates the technologies that other businesses rely on. So its AWS arm, provides the backbone of the internet that everyone relies on. It also creates surveillance technologies that then are sold to other employers. So
it's becoming just infrastructure, essentially.
Right. Absolutely. So that's my sort of preface of why Amazon is kind of worth paying particular attention to, because then the flip side, of course, is that there are now efforts to organize Amazon, which are happening in fits and starts. As you mentioned, none of them have really succeeded in the way we traditionally think of as success. And yet, given this sort of vanguard role, it's really worth looking at what those efforts are like. So the story there, the most high profile effort is once again now happening in Bessemer, Alabama, at a warehouse, as you mentioned. So there's about 5,000 to 6,000 people working in that warehouse. They filed for an NLRB election, as I explained earlier. And we got to see, I think, a lot of people who don't normally pay attention to the intricacies of US labor law got to see all the obstacles on display in, the pages of the New York Times. For example, it's legal in America for an employer to hold captive audience meetings where workers are subjected to hearing why they need to vote no on a union day in and day out. The U.S. is...
So they will essentially say, hey, I want you all to stop work, but I am going to put you all in some meeting room or hall, and you're all going to listen to my anti-union propaganda. And if you don't, that would just be a breach of your employment contract, and I could fire you if you refuse to attend the meeting.
Yes.
That's just extraordinary.
I mean, I didn't get into all of this in the sort of the specific obstacles, but really when you see the day-to-day how it plays out once you've filed for an election, it's really startling, I think. And the United States has pioneered a specific industry, which is the union busting industry. That has since gone global. These consultants operate across the world now. But it's really a homegrown industry in that a company like Amazon or many other employers hire these people who specialize in destroying the union. And so when you're
how they can use any part of the law, how they can weaponize it in order to create legal obstacles for unionization.
Absolutely. And one thing, and I'm bringing it up because we talked about those captive audience meetings. And so one thing that these consultants do, who again are paid, thousands of dollars a day to parachute into Alabama and start training people on this, is that they teach the low-level managers how to be sort of the shock troops of the campaign. Because some rich lawyer coming into your workplace isn't going to be very convincing to you. But what if your normal manager is saying those talking points? And so they train them and then they hide away, right? So there's very little disclosure required about who is doing this, but Amazon certainly made use of a veritable army of those consultants. And so they won. The workers did not vote to unionize. In a sort of unusual development, the union filed charges about Amazon breaking the law. Specifically, I don't think I'll go into it, but Amazon sort of got greedy and did in fact sort of clearly violate the meager restraints that they have during this process. And so the National Labor Relations Board did find that they violated the law. And so they ordered a rerun of that election, which is now taking place. And so workers are voting right now.
And when are those results to be expected?
Next month, I believe they are counted. So it's once again a mail-in process because of COVID. A lot of these votes are now taking place by mail rather than in person. So one thing I'll just say about all of this to sort of wrap up this story of Bessemer is that it's very hard to win a rerun election. The success rate is even lower because workers have been through these campaigns already. They've seen that they lost. And so the sort of demoralization that the employer can have doesn't go away just because it's been a year. And so I would just, as far as it's totally possible they'll win, but I would just get prepared for a sense that, all of these constraints are very real, and Amazon does not stop its scare tactics just because it's been sort of hit with a violation.
I cannot imagine how brave the people must be who are engaged in this type of campaigning against these, monstrous corporations. I mean, in my work for a blue-collar union in Iceland, I've stood with workers and organized and done activities with workers. I mean, in companies who are nowhere near Amazon, obviously, in size or influence or resources, and they enjoy far better protections legally. And still, it's very real, just the psychological burden of doing this, and this feeling of you're putting your neck out, and you're risking all kinds of repercussions for yourself personally, and it's so even in a far more protected environment, this is very, very hard. But isn't also one of the problems or challenges with Amazon is that there's incredibly high employee turnover, right? So when you build something, right, there's just this risk that in 3 or 6 months' time, the people who've spent time and energy on, building a community, building cohesion and solidarity, I mean, they may be gone, more than half of them. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. So Amazon has turnover as high as 150 to 200%, which means it's a fully new workforce or the equivalent of it every few months.
That's incredible. Yeah.
Right. Which really, I think, speaks to just how bad these jobs are. I mean, people's bodies are churned and destroyed. And Amazon, it's very similar in a way to the service industry here as far as low-paid food service work. All of this is sort of predicated on an idea of infinitely renewable labor pool, right? It doesn't matter how many workers' lives you destroy or how many just can't take it anymore and leave, because there's always someone else in the United States who will take that job. And, that speaks to the state of our welfare, that people have very little to support themselves. And the desperation is very strong here. There's so little support. And so people will take an Amazon job, and be happy for it, even if they've seen everything that it does to, say, their cousins or their parents' bodies. It doesn't matter. And that's true about fast food work here as well. The turnover rate is extraordinary. Because there isn't a sense of any kind of ties or responsibilities. It's really just, we're going to churn out as many people as we need to get the highest profits we can. And that absolutely is just devastating for any attempts to build organization. I'm sure we'll talk about Starbucks, but this is a very similar sort of thing that makes the Starbucks campaign sort of remarkable in that these jobs, it's so hard to get your feet out under you and build anything that's sustainable when your coworkers are gone the next month.
Starbucks is also similar because it's just so it's everywhere, right? In the US, it's such a huge presence, right? I mean, anywhere you go in the US, there's going to be a Starbucks, and Amazon is also literally everywhere. Right. So there have been these attempts to organize in the Starbucks locations, but that's of course quite different because those tend to be very tiny, right? I mean, each Starbucks workplace. So perhaps that can be sort of turned into an opportunity or like a benefit for workers, I suppose. Or is it the case or not?
I mean, traditional wisdom would say that hurts, right? That it's actually easier, when capital is bringing workers under the same roof and you have more people there, especially with a high turnover rate. And yet these Starbucks workers they're overcoming this by just having this speed and momentum that says we may be separated physically into stores that, as you said, employ around 30 people. That's it in each location. But we know that, across the country, there's around 230,000 people that work at Starbucks. They have about 9,000 stores. As you said, it's everywhere. And so if you imagined all of those people united, then in fact, it's a massive workplace. And so I think the workers are trying to overcome, the challenges of spatial, distance by sort of compressing time and making it feel like they're part of one united campaign, which it really, far is happening.
But the legal environment, though, is such that, I mean, is there a possibility for Starbucks workers, let's say in one city, to say we're going to unionize like the entire, all of Starbucks in the city, and sort of to claim that we will view that as like one single operation or something like that, or no?
Yeah, so there's an interesting tension here. And this is one thing that, again, I mean, if it sounds exhausting to you, imagine how exhausting it is to us, the number of intricacies of US labor law.
Sure.
So one weirdness is that the employer has the right to have a say over who's in and who's out of the bargaining unit in that campaign.
The employer gets to define what constitutes a bargaining unit?
They have standing to weigh in on that. And so, for example, how this played out in Alabama at that Amazon warehouse was that originally when the union filed for an election, I can't remember the number, but they said it was something like 3,000 or 4,000 workers in their proposed bargaining unit. Amazon and its many lawyers came in and said, no, actually, it's around 6,000. And they made sure to include workers that they figured the union had never spoken to, that the union didn't know worked. That maybe those workers operate in other parts of the facility or are, sort of on the delivery side. And so the employer has the right to make that argument. And in the case in Alabama, the National Labor Relations Board sided with the employer. They said they're right. That's who gets to vote, which then left the union scrambling, right? And so it's a very weird thing when you take a step back. Like, why does the boss have a say in who's going to be in the union? And yet that's just established practice here. So I mentioned that because at Starbucks, this is actually central to what Starbucks is arguing to try to defeat the union. They are saying on the flip side, actually, the fact that these workers are filing store by store for elections is not what they should be doing. Starbucks is trying to say, no, it has to be the whole region voting, because they're hoping basically they're banking on the idea that this union could not possibly be operating quickly enough to have organized all of the stores in a region, which is probably true. It's only been 2 months. And so Starbucks at every single, there have been almost 100 elections filed pending at stores. And in every single one of those cases, Starbucks lawyers who, as we found out, are working, they're the lawyers from one of the best union busting firms in the country. They're saying, you know what, we object. We think that the bargaining unit is not correct. It should be every store in this region or this city. And so far, the workers are winning those arguments. The board is saying that really doesn't make sense. It's pretty normal to do a store by store kind of approach. But it's not stopping Starbucks from continuing to file those objections. So, the ultimate goal, of course, of these workers is that they could set a standard at the, say, national level for, bargaining with Starbucks and setting standards. But as far as the sort of original vote by vote, they really are banking on store by store, continuing to be the approach.
Yeah, and I suppose there's always those two sides, because when you get down into that, when you get to that sort of granular level of working literally in each store, there's more obviously contact. There's more sort of rank and file. You're building it really from the bottom up. But then on the other side, of course, there's certain benefits that can be reaped from taking it to a broader level. You can do a collective contract that will just have, will be more meaningful and have more impact for more people and all of that.
Right. And that's related to, sectoral bargaining as a sort of conversation I know in many European countries, this is, more the norm. In the United States, there's now a conversation about what if we could have sectoral bargaining for, say, all fast food workers or all coffee employees.
Mm-hmm.
But that's sort of predicated on the idea that there is a strong union movement, right?
Exactly.
That there actually are workers who can raise their needs and enforce the standards.
Exactly,
you know, without the sort of existing campaign at Starbucks, for example, it would just be sort of people in a room deciding, you know, what does and doesn't count as good enough for workers. And really, there wouldn't be a way to enforce it. So this ultimately does relate to that broader, like, political question of what would it look like legislatively or otherwise to set these national standards.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I want to bring up and ask you, because you've been following these battles quite closely, and I suppose, I mean, you've been to these locations and you've talked to people and you've read the reports about what's going on in terms of these sort of like the actual personal interactions. What I'm wondering is that, from my experience of having lived in the U.S., there is, of course, a very strong individualistic culture in the U.S.
Yes.
And I mean, I remember just, you know, talking to my my mechanic about some like social issues, and there was always this like, his greatest concern was that there's this risk that people might start, you know, living off of the system, right? And that's why he didn't want to raise taxes. And I've talked sort of conversations with people that are I suppose liberals, but they would be against, you know, they would be against you know, single payer healthcare for these like weird ideological reasons that I remember being sort of shocked by.
Right.
So when it comes to the union organizing, is this a real obstacle? Is it I mean, is it the fact that people are more reluctant? Are they do they not see the benefit? Are they caught up in this like individualistic mindset that we could call it neoliberal, but it goes further back in the US? It's very deep rooted, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could tell a whole story, and I won't, about how this goes back to, you know, the founding of the United States, as far as the sense of everyone out for themselves and individualism, of course, deep-seated racism that is hugely a part of this. And also then what follows are the laws that sort of build upon those bigotries and enforce them, and then sort of prove them, you know, to have a kernel of truth. Is, you know, if you start passing laws that get the results that people were afraid of, then they're going to believe some of those founding ideas. I think it is an obstacle. You know, I describe it as, you know, people at this juncture are the idea that you and your coworkers or other people like you could actually change things, could change the conditions of your own lives together. There's very little evidence of that in the United States now. You know, unions are so few and far between. There's very little kind of social places, whether it's a union or, say, a political party, where one kind of gets a sense of what people together can do. And then there's very few social welfare programs that sort of enshrine the idea of responsibility to one another, right? I mean, there is no universal healthcare, and there's very little willingness or sort of a normalization of any kind of program that isn't means tested and sort of radically narrowed down. And so that is definitely the context in which people operate. It's absolutely, on the most micro scale, an obstacle when you're talking to a coworker to convince them that, in fact, you could change the conditions of your life. I think a lot of people don't believe it until they've seen it. And in this country, very few people have seen it. And so it's a huge obstacle. And it's also sort of, to me, one of the reasons I think labor organizing is really important is there's very few places in the United States where you can see that, because at the political level, it's just not there, of people winning real gains. Whereas it can be life-changing when you actually see it in your own workplace, when you get a good contract, or even if you don't have a formal union, if you actually just confront your boss about a problem and he caves, this can change people's understanding of what else they could do. Obviously, it's also a question of like the U.S. political system, that people are just massively disenfranchised and disempowered. You know, so few people vote in this country, and it's because it just seems like, you know, you could never change anything. So that's absolutely the context in which people operate. And, you know, it makes it all the more sort of miraculous when people do come together and fight for more. And the fact that they continue to do it, I think, is, you know, a confirmation of the fact, you know, that people will take action when pushed. But it's certainly at the most tiny level, just in every conversation, as you said, it's an obstacle to be overcome for sure.
Sure. Yeah. But that's not to say, though, that, I mean, having lived in the U.S. for a period, I was still often like pleasantly surprised to see how committed Americans can be to like certain types of like community and like doing volunteer work and activism and helping out and pitching in together. But there is, of course, this like dark side to it that, I mean, to me, it often felt like, I mean, it was like white people in America, like relatively affluent white people in America, actually love socialism if it's just for them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it's just them and their church, and like, and as far as there are no minorities involved, they're gonna love it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as it's like you have to start sharing it with those who are not considered white, then all of a sudden you become more, you know, individualistic about it, you know.
Right, absolutely. And there's so many, I mean, so many reasons for that. I mean, just spatial separation, the fact that cities are segregated here by and large. You know, there's so many,
Yes.
and the laws themselves, you know, the right to work laws that I mentioned, which are now the law of the land for most states in this country, which, to sort of boil them down, it means there's unions don't really have any security or sense of stability, right? They're constantly fighting to keep people paying dues and otherwise part of the union. Those laws were created by this guy. He was a Texas businessman and an avowed white supremacist who was an architect of Jim Crow, the sort of, you know, the racist laws in the United States post-slavery. And the reason that he was so supportive of the idea of a right to work law was like, this is a way to keep the black and white workers separate, right? We need to make sure that not only are they spatially separated, but they just have every obstacle in the way from ever being in the same room or otherwise sort of getting a sense that they, you know, have anything in common. And so, yeah, I think there's just endless examples in the US of that sense of, you know, people might be, it's acceptable to care about your community or your family or your church, but absolutely not people beyond those sort of small rings.
That said, the union movement in the U.S. has been often on the sort of on the side of inclusion, and had a voice in the civil rights movement. And unions in the U.S. tended to be more progressive when it came to taking a position against segregation than many other institutions in America, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would not gloss over unions' own sort of being implicated in these racist regimes. They're absolutely from the start were segregated unions, and some were way too slow. But when I brought up that right to work law thing, I mean, this was, again, that guy's motivation was, the context at the time was, say, the CIO, which was the big labor federation that formed in, you know, in the years after the main one, the AFL. Was people felt it was moving too slowly. It was not willing to take a stand on racism. It wasn't willing to organize at the industrial level. And in part of that hesitation was about that would mean including black workers. So the CIO forms, and it's not perfect, but it's certainly more willing to take on this issue because it understands sort of what I would call sort of the socialist analysis of racism being used to weaken everyone,
to divide the working class, of course,
right? Yes. And so those laws come in response to the fact that labor in the United States, sort of the most radical moments, and unions have always had this willingness to fight around racism, and have had black workers in particular kind of at the heart of those actions. So the idea of all communists are, you know, are pro-black and all black people are communists. This conflation of this sort of thing is absolutely very hard to untangle from labor's very real history of taking stands on those things.
But I've often read, I mean, yes, I mean, the sort of the history of working class organizing in the U.S. and how it's interacted with issues of racism is quite interesting. It's been interesting for me to read up on, because the fact is that here in Iceland, it's only very recently that there was any type of ethnic kind of diversity in the working class. It's not until, say, 5 to 10, 15 years ago that the working class in Iceland started to become more diverse. It now has a very large portion of workers who come from Eastern Europe and Poland. And the union movement in Iceland has been incredibly slow to just recognize that at the most basic level. I mean, to have materials available in languages that are understood, and to to understand that you of course need to take a firm stand against all attempts to divide the movement, right? And it's been a bit of a cultural shift, and the union that I used to work for has been at the forefront of trying to kind of like change this culture to the better, and with great success, because you find that, well, actually, regardless of whether people are from Poland or elsewhere, they have completely the same interests, and they're ready to fight, and they want to fight together for their interests,
Right. And I would certainly say the U.S. serves as a cautionary tale in this respect, in that, the labor movement, one of the sort of big flaws when it came to confronting racism was that it let things get away from it in the South. There was a willingness some labor leaders were openly racist. Obviously, as I said, there were plenty of unions that did not admit Black workers. But there was this sense that even the ones who were anti-racist weren't willing to really take a stand on this. And the result is what we have now, which is the South operates in this country as an almost entirely non-union part of the geography. And so when unions become too strong in other parts of the country, employers just move as if they were moving to another country. They move to the South.
They move to the South where they can be free of unions.
Yes. And so that's what I say. It's a cautionary tale, is that if you don't confront it from the start, you're absolutely only setting yourself up to fail down the road, because, you can only build such strong standards here when you have a whole part of the country that's not union.
Right. And that, of course, brings to mind Bessemer, Alabama, the location. This is, of course, in the Deep South. And so an interesting location to observe, unionization still happening.
Absolutely.
But as we are sort of getting shorter on time, Alex, I was just wondering if you could say something about the socialist movement in the U.S., because this community web TV station here is very much operated by people who are socialists or sympathetic to I suppose democratic socialism of the kind that's been having a growing profile in the U.S. Is there a special role for socialists in the, shall we say, growing U.S. labor movement, and if so, what is that role?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll start small with really particular examples, which is the Starbucks campaign. There's been some reporting about the people who were the first kind of people to organize at the earliest shops. And many of them not only are socialists, but were active participants in the Bernie Sanders campaign. One of them, this woman who sort of seemed to play a key initiating role in the first store to organize, she is a lifelong Eugene Debs fan, right? She is an avowed red. And so I think I bring that up because often when you dig into the specifics of any campaign, you're more likely than not to find people like that at the beginning, right? They're in the room from the start, willing to risk things
people who have had that sort of political education somehow, they've educated themselves on the history. They've begun to identify, and you speak of Eugene Debs, who was this great sort of early 20th century socialist leader in the U.S.
Right. Yeah. And a long time labor supporter, right? This guy who is sort of this iconic figure for the American left in certain parts of it. And holds this tradition to this day of kind of having, people schooled in that sort of way of thinking might be willing to take on these risks that we've now documented extensively, the sort of odds. If you're motivated in that way, you're willing to sort of withstand that, right? You're doing it not necessarily because you think you will win, but because you feel that it needs to be done, right? That the attempt has to be made. And that's always been true of U.S. labor, that the earliest organizational efforts, the most radical strikes, it was communists who were at the center of those. And in fact, a very decidedly mixed figure, this guy who was the first president of the CIO, he often spoke of, people would criticize him for hiring communists. And he was not a communist himself, but he said, who's a better organizer than that?
Was that John Lewis who said that?
John Lewis, yes.
Right. Yes.
So not a perfect figure by any means, but a sort of recognition of the role that the left has always played in this country. That, if you're looking for people to take on a tough fight, absolutely the socialist left should be a part of that. I think the particular context of, this sort of millennial rise of this socialism or democratic socialist leanings, A lot of that energy, now that the Sanders campaigns have gone away, some of it is being routed directly into the labor movement. I mean, just it's not things that you can find publicly, but it's just so many people who were sort of early politicization was around those campaigns. They now are organizing unions in their workplace, or they're working for unions directly. It's really pretty impressive. Many of those people are, of course, members of Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, where there's sort of, I think, on one level, a sort of a sense of lack of direction now that there's no Sanders campaigns. But below the surface, there is a lot of energy going into precisely this. People have sort of reached the conclusions that the political goals can't be reached with the labor movement in the state that it's in. And so I think absolutely the socialist left has a role to play in not just the actual organizational sort of day-to-day of a workplace campaign, but also cohering it nationally, right? Having sort of the ties in the organizational infrastructure to take these campaigns and sort of generalize them across the country, to sort of raise political demands related to those campaigns. And also to have a sense of the international ties and sort of energies that need to be directed. And so DSA, I think, is in fact in certain parts doing exactly what I would think it should.
The Democratic Socialists of America, the small but growing Socialist Party, which has supported the campaigns of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and of course of Bernie Sanders, and has tended to work often within the Democratic Party. Yes, and just to
and so I would say that is so that for the socialist left in this country, I think prioritizing that as well as a number of other areas, there, especially during COVID now, there have been an uptick in sort of housing struggles, fights over to stop evictions, to sort of pause rent increases. So there's all these tenants unions forming of renters in a building, say, taking on a fight. So those are the types of things that DSA members, I think, are really getting involved in and committing to in a long-term way. But yeah, absolutely. When you sort of see in a mainstream paper some shocking, the rise of some union campaign that you're like, I never saw that coming. Often when you look, it was in fact the young socialists who were kind of there from the beginning trying to urge it on.
I mean, that is the thing. Yeah, I mean, that is just so positive and just inspiring to hear, because of, I mean, to me, it's often felt like there's been this sort of ebb and flow in sort of movements and in activism, right? I mean, there was the Iraq War and Islamophobia and all of that stuff, which, was like it was a certain, peak. And then there was the Sanders campaign, which was a certain peak. And then it's like, oh, we didn't succeed. But it seems that, I mean, of course, labor issues are always there. And if you can start building, if you can get into a mindset where you keep your focus on those issues, they are going to be there. They're not going to go away. And they're very close, obviously, to people's, everyday experiences, especially if you can sort of frame them in that way.
I would just add that I think one thing that the socialist left in the United States for a long time has been trying to overcome is a product of that division between the socialist left and the labor movement, right? That's a product of those purges predominantly, in my opinion. But there's all sorts of reasons that, when you look at who the sort of most visible socialists in the United States are, it is this very narrow fragment of the working class. It's like well-educated, downwardly mobile, heavily student indebted people, a particular type of person kind of predominates. And I think
it's a certain demographic.
And I think at this point, one of the projects, not just of DSA, but of I think a lot of radicals in this country, is how do you heal that? How do you end that divide and actually make socialism a broad working class movement? So make not that you know what I'm saying. And so that type of labor work, whether it's it both does that work, but also brings that demographic into conversation and relationships with the broader working class, right? When there's a strike at, say, Kellogg's, and you have DSA members on the picket lines and donating and holding events in support, all of a sudden you're actually building those ties in a very real way that overcomes this problem. And so I think that is also really kind of a main thing that a lot of socialists are focused on, and why they're kind of turning to labor in this way, the sense that that's where they have to build the relationships.
That's that's just that makes such sense. And I'm reminded, I mean, because the time that I spent living in the U.S., I lived in Ohio, and in the sort of like the sort of like very much like middle America, Columbus, very typical American city. And I was there during the time of Occupy, and Occupy just did not happen in Ohio, right? This was just something that was going on in the coastal cities. There was just no. But I happened to be in academia, so of course people there were like who were excited about this, right? But then you looked out the window and there was just no Occupy there. Just it was not happening. Black Lives Matter was certainly happening a lot more. You could see it a lot more because it's like relevant in a city like Columbus, like many of the Midwestern cities obviously have those issues clearly. But the Bernie Sanders campaign very much happened in Columbus, Ohio. And I remember this strange change. I mean, all of a sudden I was like talking about politics with my mechanic, right? About issues that it would have seemed impossible just like a year earlier to even like get started on talking, right? So, I mean, it seems that the Bernie Sanders campaign opened up this like space where, it wasn't a taboo to talk about, to even use the word socialism, and to talk about all of those issues that he was putting at the forefront, and so it seems like you're saying that maybe sort of like the aftermath, or like the sort of like the continuing life of this movement maybe is that it's logical for it to continue in labor issues and in organized labor.
Right. I mean, I think one thing about the Sanders campaign offered an opportunity to get outside of the sort of bubble that a lot of the left had been operating in, sometimes by choice, often because there was nowhere else to go. The left is so small, often constrained to academia, as you said. That's sort of the holdout of where you can be openly a radical in this country. And the Sanders campaign all of a sudden was like, you know what, actually, we're going to now talk to the whole country, right? Which was a very good, I think, learning experience for a lot of people. And there was a sense that you don't want to go back to being small. We actually are talking about like, what does it mean to hold power and to build a movement of people that don't all agree with each other, but sort of share common interests. And so, I think unions have been that in the United States. It's a place where millions of people are that don't necessarily hold all the same ideas, but share an interest in, workplace power and better contracts and things like that. And so to me, it makes sense, this move from, a sort of insularity to a sense of, no, we want to stop preaching to the choir, and we're talking about actually changing people's minds.
I couldn't agree more. Alex. And so my producer's giving me the heads up that we're about to run out of time. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation, Alex. Great to get the opportunity to learn from you about issues of organized labor in the U.S. Maybe we can have you again on the show. Maybe you can point us maybe to other people that we could talk about on the show. But and I will make sure to post some links for people so that they can read up on some of your writings about labor campaigns in the U.S. But on that note, I think I'll just say thank you, Alex. Best of luck in your work, and we'll see you around.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having me. Have a good one.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.